Is there
Okay.
another question? Yeah.
Yes, we have one other question at the moment. Patricia Kranz asked, did you speak Mandarin or Cantonese at home with your parents? Did language ability help you cover China?
I think language ability is very valuable for covering China. I know some very good reporters who have gone to China with very little Chinese, but I think that in general, on balance, knowing Mandarin is very helpful. Mandarin is by far more helpful than Cantonese. I grew up speaking Cantonese in my household with my family. We spoke both English and Cantonese, and I was much more fluent in Cantonese, before I started studying Mandarin as a young adult. And so I started studying Mandarin in my 20s after graduating from college and then going to Beijing after that newspaper job at the Potomac Gazette to start studying Mandarin. And that was obviously helpful and kept up those studies in graduate school. And then later on did more studies in between Iraq and China. But I think having Mandarin is very helpful. Um, Cantonese works very well in the south of China, in Guangdong province and in Hong Kong, but it doesn't really help you in other parts of China because the languages are very different. I would also say that on balance, like being of like Asian descent helped me in China because I could go around to different places, very remote places like Altai, which we talked about, sensitive places, Xinjiang, Tibetan areas, towns where protests were happening, and people wouldn't really look at me twice. The police who would be on the streets, the average citizens, they wouldn't really look at me and think, oh, there's a weird presence in the town or someone from an outsiders in the town. Even if I spoke to people and they heard my accent, I usually speak with a Cantonese accent. People say I sound like I'm from southern China. They'll just assume I'm someone whose ancestry was in the South, or I was visiting as a tourist in some areas from, say, Guangdong, and I would sort of just say I'm Cantonese. I would tell them straight up I'm Cantonese, which I am, and they would just accept that I was like, there from Guangdong province or something like that. So I think that helps, like looking Asian and then being able to speak Mandarin.
Even speaking Mandarin, for me, it's hard to understand accents in different parts of China. Even understanding the Beijing accent,
Yeah.
I have the Taiwanese accent. When I was in Taiwan speaking like I could speak Mandarin, I can't read it. And I was trying to interview officials over the phone in Mandarin to cover the 1999 earthquake. And I remember them saying, wow, your Chinese is so good when they found out I was an ABC, American born Chinese, but I didn't have the right vocabulary to interview officials, like the official language that you
Right.
hear on the news. I have a
Yeah.
conversational Mandarin, so it's still very difficult.
Yeah, it is difficult. And I think the accents or the different dialects makes it like doubly difficult, of course. And so sometimes I would travel to different parts of China with a Chinese reporter from our bureau. And, especially if they were from that region, then they could understand the regional dialect or the regional language. So Sichuan is a good example. And I encountered that pretty early on when I was there covering the 2008 earthquake in Sichuan. And it was very up there in the villages in the mountains, like it's very difficult understanding people when you're just speaking standard Mandarin. And you need to have beside you someone who can, understand some of the local language or the way they speak, I think.
We
There's
do
another
have,
question from William. Go ahead.
yes, you see it. Yes, yes. Um, so the question is, how has Xi's more aggressive use of cyber espionage and penetration of American institutions impacted the Chinese American community? Are they worried about getting caught in the middle?
I would say, I think that's a good question. I would say that it's some Chinese Americans are worried. They're worried about the general geopolitical tensions that have arisen. They don't want to be put under unfair scrutiny. I think that's probably more true of recent immigrants from China, less true of ones who've been here for multiple generations. Recent immigrants or people here on various forms of visas, I think, feel under greater scrutiny these days. And and that started, I think, in the Trump era also. So it's not like she's more aggressive policies obviously provoke a reaction from the U.S. government, but in the Trump era, there were also very aggressive initiatives that resulted in overreach in some areas. So one good example is the China initiative that the Justice Department undertook, where they were aggressively investigating scientists who had come from China. And so in some of these circumstances, the cases didn't really hold up. The Justice Department had to dismiss the charges or never brought charges. And then in several places, the judges in the courts dismissed the cases. But for many of the Chinese visa holders or Chinese immigrants who were the scientists in those cases, then they had their research and their lives turned upside down by these investigations. And so that's an example of them being caught in the middle and feeling a lot of pressure. And that's, I think, in some ways, Bill, that's what you're talking about in terms of China increasing its espionage and the spillover effects that has on the American government. But it's also an example of overreach on the part of some American agencies as they try and grapple with this growing question of espionage by the Chinese government.
Those are good questions. We have about 8 minutes left, and I just want to make sure we answer everyone's questions. So please type away. Or Sandra, Patricia, any other questions from you? No, I'm going to keep talking to Ed because one of the things we didn't get to earlier was about writing. Since this is about your book, I want to encourage folks to get a copy. Where and when do you write the best when you were working on your book?
I mean, my writing process was kind of a mess because I started it in 2018, right when I was starting this beat covering diplomacy and foreign policy for the New York Times. And so when you're on my beat, it's a heavy travel beat. Like I'm often flying overseas, either with the Secretary of State or to report on events overseas, like when Trump met with Kim Jong-un in Hanoi, for example. That was in 2019, or sometimes doing enterprise stories or investigative stories and then going to country to report on it. And so when I'm traveling, I find it impossible to write. Like I tried writing on airplanes, I tried writing in hotels, but it's just impossible to get into the mindset and to have the right energy and the right vibe to write on the book. So I would often, in those early years, wake up early in the morning and try and write while I was in DC, in those times I was in DC, write on weekends. And then at some point in the early part of the pandemic, I got a book leave because I think it was transitioning from Trump to Biden. And so that's often a natural time for some reporters to step back and work on a book or other project because you have a new administration coming in. So I took a book leave, was off for some months, and did a big chunk of the writing then for the first draft, enough to maintain momentum on the book and to feel like that I would end up finishing the book. I think for many book writers, that's the point that you want to reach, is you want to reach a point where you know for 100% that you're going to finish this book, that you're not going to abandon it as a project. Once you're at that point, then I think you're basically in the home stretch, even if you have, say, a third of the book or a quarter of the book to finish. Because, just like running a marathon, a lot of writing a book is psychological. We all have the tools to do it. Like you and I, Tracy, like we write for a living. We all know how to put together sentences, and our writing is cleaner and sharper than the writing of the average person. So I would say that because we've been doing it for decades, and we know how to do research, get facts. The question is like whether you can complete that marathon, I think.
I really admire discipline for sure.